super cool house you got here.
Right?
Yeah.
Outside it's really nice. We got lucky with the weather this year.
Weathers. I packed all my winter clothes. That's like
Yeah.
coming from cold Copenhagen, right? I was like, I thought it would be colder here.
Yeah.
But that's super nice.
I saw as well last week was like -20 and I thought, okay, it's gonna be like that now too.
Yeah. Yeah, but this is great. Are we ready? I think so. Let's go. Okay, so it looks like this will be a very nice and cozy workshop. I don't know if one of you actually were ready to be hands-on coding. If not, that's perfectly fine. I can just run through the code. But for those of you interested, we can do a code along. But if not, it's perfectly fine. I'll just give an overview of what we're building and how you can use it. So my name is Jacob. I'm from Phylax, and we're building a new primitive for security called Assertions, which basically, I'll get into what it is a little bit later. But our mission at the moment, we're a small team dedicated to solving security, so crypto can win. As you all probably know, security is a big problem. Just look back 4 days to Friday when Bybit was having a small incident. And basically we're building the credible security layer, which enables dApps to embed and verifiably enforce security rules on the base layer. So you can basically deploy Capital confidently, do your DeFi protocol confidently. What we'll be doing today, a little bit about what Phylax is, already did that. Then I'll talk a bit about why security actually matters. Hopefully most of you already know, but it's always good to talk a little bit more about that. Then I will talk about what the credible layer is, how assertions work, and then I wanted to also show how to write and test assertions. Let's see if there's time for that. Maybe there is, since no one will be coding along, so it's good for my odds. Why should you care about security? I think 2024, around 2 billion lost to hacks. 2025 is not on a good path, if you want to say it like that. So we have 1.5 billion lost to hacks already, and it's only the end of February. Let's hope we don't continue this trend. For once, I actually was early and had my slides done on Thursday, so I had to change them a little bit to include this small incident we had on Friday with Bybit. And I think it's a very good example of how important security is. And even in a case like this, where they supposedly had a good setup in their multi-sig, signing on different devices whatsoever, just the fact that it's still possible for them to be compromised and that they don't have any fail-safes in place because they maybe thought they would never get compromised, I think that alone is a good reason why we should care more about security. And actually what we're building could have worked as a hack prevention or at least a damage control system that would only allow a certain amount of funds to be transferred out of safe at any given point in time. I'll talk a little bit more about how that works. In general, except of this big hack, then we see a tendency where there are more and more small hacks. That means there are more and more projects in the space, which is a good thing. But we also see more and more hacks, so more and more projects care less and less about security, unfortunately. Also, then we see a lot of projects getting audits, which is a good thing, but unfortunately, it's kind of a one-off thing. And as soon as you change your code a little bit, you basically need to get another audit, and they're super expensive. I think, depending on your code size, a good audit is somewhere around $100,000, which a lot of projects can't really afford, so they skip it, which is not good. Formal verification is another way you can go around fixing security, or at least verifying it, but that's also super difficult. There are a lot of systems that are just not possible to even verify. And there's no such thing as perfect code. Like, there are bugs everywhere. Even the most audited and whatever code might have bugs that will be shown down the path eventually. Right, so what can we do to solve this? So we're trying to build something that is not as expensive and basically can help you improve security of all smart contracts without paying a lot of money and without spending a lot of resources doing so. So that's where the private, the Phylax credible layer comes into play. Basically, you define what a hack looks like in your protocol. So let's say you're some DeFi protocol or something like that. You can define invariants, saying we never want the collateral, the C ratio to be below or something, below or above some number. So that's basically an invariant you can define, and then the Phylax credible layer will always check if after each transaction that happens, are all the invariants still maintained. So we actually can prevent attacks instead of, or preventing exploits instead of doing next block mitigation or whatever you see at the moment with a lot of these other hack prevention systems. They basically detect that there was an attack and then they do mitigation after the fact, which usually is too late. We currently will be only supporting layer 2s with centralized sequencers because we basically implement at the base layer, so at the sequencer layer as part of the builder. And that wouldn't really be that easy to do on the mainnet at the moment, so that's where we put our focus. And it doesn't introduce any additional trust assumptions because people already trust the centralized sequencers. And how it works more precisely is that we do off-chain simulation. So basically before each block, we look at all the transactions that are supposed to go into the block. Then we simulate all of them off-chain. And then we check the assertions that we have defined, if they all still hold. If some of them break or are invalidated, then they revert the transaction. So the transactions that would potentially result in an undesired state in your protocol, they will not be included in the block at all. So they will never touch the chain even. And how we do this is with assertions. Assertions have a very familiar syntax. They're basically written in Solidity, and they use what we call Phylax STD, which is a small library that adds some precompiles that give you functionality to like look at the state before a transaction, after a transaction. And the cool thing is that it's basically, there's no context switching. So if you know how to write Solidity, you know how to use this. You don't need to learn some obscure language to do your formal verification or to define invariants or something like that in a weird way. You can do it in Solidity. And as I mentioned earlier, we have these cool precompiles that allow you to, for example, check all state changes for a storage slot within a call stack of a transaction. So you can basically compare the state through a full transaction. That could be in a flash loan attack or something like that, where people usually manipulate the price of an oracle or something like that. But here we can actually see, okay, does it deviate more than we want within a transaction, and then we can cancel the transaction. You define what a hack looks like, so you don't have to think about all the edge cases that can lead to a hack. You just have to know what state you don't want to reach, which I think is very cool. You can think of it a little bit like negative or reverse intents. And it saves the developers a lot of time because you don't have to think about all the edge cases. And they're deployed independently, so you don't write it as part of your deployed smart contracts. You write it basically as part of your tests, and then how it works is later on you can upload the assertions, and then they are enforced on-chain. But you don't need to prepare it when you are preparing your smart contracts for deployment. And if you notice if you notice a bug or an exploit in your smart contracts after deployment, you can also use assertions to kind of fix or mitigate the bug until you're ready to deploy a new version. So this is very simple how an assertion is executed. So we have like the order flow, which is all the transactions. The builder receives the transactions and then runs all these rules against the transaction and only includes the transaction that pass the rules that we defined. Okay. I think none of you are going to follow the guide, so I'll just go through the code and show what assertions look like. Let's skip this. Okay, so we have a simple lending protocol that I've created with a couple of bugs inside of it. I'll show you the code in a moment. But basically, users can deposit ETH as collateral and borrow an ERC20 token against it. Simple lending protocol, and we make sure that there's like 75% C ratio, and we have a price feed that determines price and tracks individual positions. But there are a couple of problems. One is that the withdraw function doesn't check if the user, when he withdraws F, if his C ratio is still valid. So that's something I on purposely left out. And the other one is there's basically an even more buggy withdrawal that allows the user to just withdraw as much as F as he wants from the protocol. So we just want to write assertions that can check or make sure that this doesn't happen. So what could be one way of doing that? That would be to check after each call to withdraw. We can check that the address that withdraws, that his position is still within the allowed C ratio. And for the functionality that allows for basically unlimited withdrawal, we can just check that there's not like a big amount of F being withdrawn in one transaction. Great. So here is the piece of code of the withdrawal bug. As you can see, there's basically no check making sure that it's a valid withdrawal and that his position is still healthy. So that's a mistake on the developer's side. But and this could be like, there are many good examples of where something like this could happen. Some of you might know the Euler finance hack that happened in 2023, I think. The protocol was actually perfectly healthy, and then they added a new function called donate, where you could donate funds, and this function didn't have a health check. So that meant you could donate to that, and then you could get into some weird collateral ratios that basically allowed people to drain the protocol. So that's a good example of where if they had had an assertion in place that would always check that any position is healthy, then this wouldn't have happened, even though they actually added a functionality or a function that didn't have this check. So I think that gives you an idea of how powerful assertions can be, because you can actually define the invariants for your protocol. And in many cases now you can define the invariants, but you can only check or test the invariants in your testing suite, but not in your smart contracts, because it's often too expensive, because the computations for invariants, they're more complex than what you can basically afford in gas. So let's talk a bit about assertions. As I said, they're implemented in Solidity. We have a couple of cheat codes. That's what it basically starts with PH. So we have PH fork post state that directly gives you the state after the transaction has been simulated, and then you can run some tests on the new state of the transaction before it's included into the blockchain. So what we do here is we basically just get the price of F and the token price, and we check if the total collateral and the total borrow of the protocol is at the correct ratio that we want, so that there's not something breaking this invariant of the protocol. So this is pretty standard. And basically what you do is you write a require, and if this require reverts, then the transaction reverts, and the transaction is not included in the block. Then for specific individual positions, we have another cheat code in place. This is the PH get call inputs. This one basically gets you all the inputs for all the calls in a transaction. So let's say you have a transaction that does like 10 different things. You can get all the inputs that take place for the withdraw selector. So there'll be, this is all withdraws within the transaction. We then check for each of them, we check that the position of the caller is still healthy. So this is actually super powerful, that you are able to define these kind of behaviors in Solidity, and to make sure that there are no transactions included that break these very important invariants of your system. Okay, the drain bug we can just skip, because this is like absolutely terrible. No one would ever do this if this was deployed. But the idea is just to show that if there is a way that someone figures out how to withdraw unlimited amounts of ETH or something like that from your protocol, similar to what happened in the Bybit hack. I know that they basically manipulated a multisig, but similar concept. Then we could have something like, say, we would never allow more than maximum 50% to be withdrawn. More realistically would probably be 5% or 10%. But you can basically define any logic like this. So you could say, like, we don't want more than 10,000 ETH to ever be withdrawn in one transaction. So it's not super good, because, like, if a hacker knew, okay, I can see they have this 50%, I'll just withdraw 59 or 49%. Yeah, okay, good. But it could still work for some kind of damage control. You'll still get wrecked somehow. Maybe Bybit would have lost 10,000 instead of 400,000 ETH, which is still an improvement over what happened, right? Yeah, the second one, I already talked a little bit about this, is, for example, we can do price manipulation attack mitigation or prevention with the get state changes cheat code, which gives you all the state changes within the call stack for a storage slot. So it's a little bit more cumbersome to write this, because you basically need to know the exact storage slot in your contract, but you would probably know that if you're also the engineer or the developer who wrote the smart contract. But you can basically define a storage slot, and then you get all the state changes that happened for this specific storage slot in the call stack. And that's kind of cool, because in this case we can then look at what is the price pre-state, so what is the price before the transaction, and then we have this pre-token price, and then we can compare it with all the calls within the call stack, and we can see if any of them have a deviation of more than 10%, and if that happens, that is like something we have decided we don't want that, especially for a stable coin. That's crazy. Then we revert the transaction. So this is actually one of the ways we think that we in the future can kind of start avoiding some of these flash loan price manipulation attacks we sometimes see, which is something that hasn't really been a good solution to yet. So I think we're building something that allows people to really dig deep into what is happening in call stacks and then prevent specific behavior. I'm way ahead of time because I thought we would be doing some code along, but let me just, you can definitely read this, right? Yeah, so the basic setup of a project will be you have your source code similar to any Foundry project or whatever. This is basically a fork of Foundry. So anything you're used to in Foundry and Forge, you can do the same. We just have some added functionality on top. So if you're used to Foundry, Forge, this will be super natural for you to do. So you have your source file here. This is just this simple lending that I showed, where we have this, broken withdraw function that we have here. And then when we write the assertion, we basically just import the source file, and then we also import the credible STD, which is our assertion from a credible STD, which is our library. And then you just basically define the triggers. This is the assertions that you want to execute every time there is a transaction taking place in the smart contract that you are monitoring. So what you basically do is you have the assertion, and then you upload the assertion and connect it to the deployed smart contract that you own. And an assertion itself is very simple. You just define it here, and you use the cheat codes I mentioned before. This is one of the assertions I showed. And that's basically all. As I mentioned, if the transaction or if an assertion reverts, the transaction will be ignored. Yeah, so then you just interact with your protocol. You can call all the functions that you have available in your own protocol. You could also define, I don't know, custom health checks, stuff like that. We're working as well on a cheat code that would allow you to basically iterate through all positions in a mapping. So this is something that is super expensive to do in Solidity because of the gas price of iterating, especially if you have like thousands or even millions of positions. But we are trying to build a way you can do this as well in Assertions, which will be a very good way to ensure that you can maintain invariance, because you can basically then say, okay, what is the value of all positions in the protocol, and compare it with the total balance that the protocol itself is basically reporting, because usually you don't really have a connection between the two. You just say, okay, every time there's a new position, we add the amount of tokens added there, we add that to the total collateral, but you don't really have a way to check that these two amounts actually match. So I think that's one of the invariants that we can really help people make sure it's always maintained, because you can't do this in simple Solidity. And we also offer functionality to test your assertions. This is very similar as well to writing tests in Forge, where you have a setup function that basically sets up the environment you want to test against. And then we have two specific helpers, like these CL is the critical layer. We have add assertion and we have validate. And the add assertion just defines the contract for which we should add the assertions, and validate then executes a transaction. In this case it would withdraw with 0.5 F, which would fail in this case because the user has borrowed $1,500, which is exactly 75% C ratio. So if he then withdraws 0.5 Ether, his C ratio would be over 75%, which should fail. So in this case, we have VM expect revert, which means that this assertion, like this validation, is expected to revert. And if it reverts, that means that the invalid state was prevented. And likewise here, we have the same setup, but instead he borrows $500, so his C ratio is only 25, and that allows him to withdraw 0.5 F. And as you can see, we do not, above validate, have expect revert, because this transaction does not revert. This is allowed. So this is how you can then test that your assertions work. I have a small test suite here. Always good to show that it actually works. And yeah, all the tests are passing for this project.
Nice.
Yeah, that is good. Yeah, and that's basically like you can also define, for example, in this price feed, I have like a small helper or batch token price. So I basically here I make a transaction that calls set price 8 times or something like that, so that we actually can use this cheat code where we check all the state changes. And as you can see here, this one would trigger it because it's 15% price deviation. So this one also fails. So you can actually quite easily write some pretty powerful tests to test that your assertions work as expected. Once you have a passing test suite, this is like simple. You'll probably also add some more end-to-end testing, but here you get an idea of how to write the test. Once you have that, you would actually upload your assertions to our front end that allows you to connect assertions to your smart contracts. And then the builder will start enforcing these assertions against the state of your smart contracts. So actually, I think that's pretty much everything from me. Since we're not coding along, it's much faster than expected. I was planning quite a lot of time for debugging. Any questions or something like that? Yeah, go ahead.
So where do the assertions sit between the contract? Like, are you just deploying it as like another smart contract to have your functions route through them?
Yeah, basically. So you still deploy the smart contracts. You still deploy the assertion collections. We call it assertion collection. The contract that has the assertions, you still deploy that, but they will basically never be executed on chain. They will then be run as part of the block building process. So they will run the smart contracts, but they run them off chain. They simulate it all and then check the assertions.
So you can see then that these are the assertions that are going to run on this contract,
Yes. So basically, they will be public, like they will be on chain. So anyone can basically see the assertions, which is both good and bad, right? If you're trying to like upload them to fix a bug in your own code, you really have to hope that like they're not front run somehow and that someone actually sees them before they're enforced or something like that. And then because then you basically get a recipe of how to hack your protocol served on a silver platter, right?
Is there any way to like not enforce that? Like if you are the block builder, are you able to like bypass the assertion, or is it just you're executing it on in the contract already, so it has to go through it? And I
So
guess
in
follow-up question.
yeah, go ahead.
Are you paying for the gas of doing that assertion after it successfully executes?
So first question, the block builder or the sequencer could, in theory, choose to ignore what the assertion tells it to do, but that would be the same as the sequencer, like the centralized sequencers we already trust doing different things than what we tell it to do. That's kind of the same idea, right? So, and since the sequencers are centralized known entities, we would expect as well that they can basically be prosecuted for breaking the rules, so to speak, and they would lose a lot of social credit as well, which would probably down the line hurt them or damage them more than allowing for a hack to take place. But in theory, you could bribe them and they would potentially allow a hack to go through. But we do believe that the legal implications and social implications of that that they're bigger than what they're interested in doing. Otherwise, we'll probably already see that on centralized sequencers, right? And for the other question, the gas, since the computation is happening off chain, we don't really you don't really have to pay for that gas. We do still do gas metering like on the off-chain calculations to make sure that if we have to to make sure that they could fit down the line, we want to also make proofs of invalidated transactions with like zero-knowledge proof, where we basically allow auditors or bug hunters to create a zero-knowledge proof that shows that they can make a transaction that invalidates an assertion, right? Because then you basically show that you have found a way to exploit the contract. But yeah, I don't know if that answered the gas question, but basically, since we do the calculations off-chain, the gas price is, yeah.
I guess you could also open it up to, sorry, I didn't hear.
No, you
So
go
like
ahead.
other execution environments and not just Solidity since it's not being executed.
Yeah, it actually doesn't matter about like whatever's compiles to EVM. So like we are also working on similarly to have like, it doesn't matter. You could define them in Viper as well. Yeah.
How does the gas consumption compare to, say I were to implement in my V1 of my protocol a bunch of assert methods as helpers of my contract that would keep track of all these variables and obviously cost more gas per execution, but if I were to use your assertions, how does that compare?
Yeah, so like the thing is in a lot of cases, the best practice is to follow like this fry pie or whatever it's called, where you basically have like, you have your pre-checks, like your pre-requires and stuff like that of your functions. Then you have the logic, the state changes, and then you again, at the end of the function, you have basically a new round of checks, making sure that everything is as it should be. Like basically that your invariants are maintained. That's what you will do in best practice Solidity smart contracts. But that it quickly gets quite expensive. And some of the stuff you can do here is just not possible. Like you cannot inspect the call stack in your Solidity code, for example, right? That's why we still see flash loan attacks and price manipulation attacks, because you cannot detect that in Solidity itself. So one of the ideas is that we have these cheat codes that basically give you more functionality and more or like more ways you can check for exploits. And also, yeah, then you take some of the calculations off chain that makes it in general cheaper to use your protocol. But probably best practice would be if you have something that is like really business logic important, that you probably still keep that in your Solidity code as well. I would not recommend using assertions as and just remove all requires from your code base, but use it as an extra layer of security on top.
Cool. Thanks.
Would this help, like the Bybit situation? Say you deployed an assertion that was one of the things. Like, let me know if this is off base, but like you could theoretically set up an assertion contract to dynamically allow for kind of proposing transfers from a safe to another wallet. Say they were doing some high-risk transaction like that. Would assertions add another layer of security in that case, where you would first say, okay, I expect the safe address to have 500 ETH removed from it, and I expect this specific address that I want it sent to, maybe it's another safe, to have plus 500 ETH after it. And then after deploying that assertion, then I'll go through the safe and actually process that. And if the safe front end is manipulated, then that would fail, right? Is that like a valid use case?
Yeah, you could do something exactly like that. You could also set up an assertion saying, this is the whitelist. Like, these are the 5 addresses that I know I will be sending tokens or funds to from my safe, and only allow these 5 to actually be the receivers of your transactions. And in the same way, if you don't know, then you could have put in some kind of damage control saying, I will never allow more than 10,000 ETH to be transferred out, because that would, I don't remember, I think there was around 10,000. That is like the maximum they usually transferred out from the cold wallet to a hot wallet. So they could set at least that as a limit. But yeah, the thing with the whitelist is a good idea. And in the similar way, back in October, we had this Radiant finance hack. I think they're called Radiant. They're called Radiant, which was basically the same thing that happened, where a safe was like the front end, I assume, was manipulated to make the signers sign a bad transaction. The fact that they had a multisig that was 3 out of 11. Let's not talk about that. But that was also probably made it a little bit easier to compromise them. But in that case, the hacker basically used it to change ownership of a proxy contract, I think it was, that basically controlled all the funds, so that the hacker was now the new owner, or a new contract was the owner. And in that case, you could also have said, okay, in general, it's very unlikely that you want to change the owner of something like this. It's good to have in place for emergencies, but it's so rare that you actually change the owner. So you could say, okay, we don't want to allow for ownership change, and if we ever need to do it, we will only allow it to be changed to this address. So in that case, it wouldn't have been possible to change it to some generic address that the hacker had set up. So that would actually be some ways that it would be possible to prevent attacks like this in a fairly simple way, where it's actually enforced on-chain through at the sequencer level.
How about the immutability of those assertions? Like, once they're posted on-chain, can the existing assertions be modified, and then also can you extend the assertions if you want to later on, or are they fixed?
They're not fixed. So they're fixed, but you can just disable them. Okay. So you could upload a new one and say this one should be in place of that one, or something like that. So that's one of the powers as well, is like you can also add them after the fact, right? You can say, okay, we just realized that we have this invariant that we don't have a test for or anything like that. Let's add an assertion just to be on the safe side, right? And in the same way, you can say, okay, we know that we have an upcoming owner change of some contract. Let's already whitelist that one in an assertion to make sure that there's nothing going wrong, and that if we get hijacked in our safe or whatever, then we have this extra layer of security. So I definitely think that with something like this, what I want people to do is basically start thinking more as, like, when you're designing your smart contracts, have your invariants in mind always, like know what are the invariants of my protocol, I think that's like the next step we will see. That like some protocols do it already, but it's a super healthy exercise to do. And then after that, start enforcing these invariants through tools like Assertions that can basically prevent hacks from happening. And I mean, we should do everything we can, even if we think that this assertion will never ever be triggered. It's fine, because like better safe than sorry, right? So yeah, we're building hack prevention that will hopefully never be used, but the day it will be, then it's worth all the hassle of doing it, right? And it's really not that difficult. I think I did a test one day with a friend of mine who's a pretty good smart contract developer working at a DeFi protocol, and I showed him what I showed you guys basically, and he then sat down in half an hour. He had 3 assertions written for his own protocol, so it's really easy. Once you understand what an assertion is and how the syntax is, then you can do it in very little time. Any more questions? Yeah, let's go.
What's like the incentive of the block builder to execute extra code on top of that, since you're not getting gas?
Yes. So basically, there will be down the line. In the beginning, we're very early. We only like have the first version of the syntax ready now. But down the line, we will have incentives in place where you basically, as a protocol, you pay for having your assertions active. So basically, every time a transaction is run that checks the assertions, even if they don't trigger, but just checks them, then you will pay in some token or in the gas fee in the gas token of the chain.
I don't think it's totally unreasonable that someone like Inc would want to use it as a differentiator from like Base.
I don't think so either, and I hope they would. Or we hope they would. Like that's the goal. Like we like integrating with as many L2 networks as possible, and really appealing to make sure that they care about make sure they care more about security, right? And if you can offer something like this as a differentiator to the dApps that are building on Inc rather than Base or vice versa, I think that's a really nice differentiator to be able to offer. Anything else? No. Okay. I really enjoyed the conversation. I think that's nice and good questions. So thank you a lot for that, guys.
Thank you.
You're welcome.